Welcome to another lesson on Windows PowerShell 7. In this tutorial, I will be using the Visual Studio Code ISE. If you need help with installing and configuring this integrated scripting environment, please check my earlier lessons in this series. Today I will go over creating functions in PowerShell scripts. I'm using PowerShell version number 7, but however, what we are covering today is still applicable for previous versions of PowerShell. First of all, you need to know what are functions. In scripts or software code, functions allow us to reuse code. Functions are basically blocks of organized code that can be called in elsewhere in your script. In PowerShell, just like many other scripting and programming languages, you can create your own functions in addition to the functions that already comes with the program. For example, let's look at a simple calculation, right? So we have 10 plus 5, and I need to add these two together. If I run this code, it should return 15, and it did. What if we have to repeat such calculation over and over? In that situation, you can create a function, and within it, you can include this 10 plus 5 calculation. In PowerShell, it is best to use verb-noun naming convention when you are creating a function. So if I'm going to create a function that will add 10 to 5, I'm going to create a function using the PowerShell verb-noun naming convention. You may recall from my previous tutorials, the verb-noun naming convention is a convention that we often use in PowerShell so that it is consistent across the board. So how can I create a function here, right? So I'm going to clear the screen below the terminal. To make this into a function, what I need to do, I'm going to press enter here. I'm going to include this calculation within my new function. So I'm going to start that by typing function. So when you type halfway through, remember, because we are in a integrated scripting environment, it already have that option right here. So we can click on that. That automatically put this entire thing in here. And then you can start adding information within it. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you a simple way of doing it. Like if you don't have an integrated environment, if I type function, and then if I go add dash numbers, why is add dash numbers? Because that's what I decided my function name going to be. And we're going to do this curly bracket thingy. And we can press enter. And now I can type anything in between this first curly bracket opening and the last curly bracket right here, the second curly bracket up down here, the closing, whatever I need to be included in this function. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete this last line of code. I'm going to press tab and press 10 plus 5. So now I have a simple function. It doesn't have many information in it. It doesn't have that original, it doesn't have the param or anything in here. Instead, I have a simple function. So if you are starting out writing functions in Windows PowerShell, this is how you start out. If I run this piece of code, would you expect it to return 15? Let's see. If I run this code, what does it return? Absolutely nothing. So few minutes ago, I showed you 10 plus 5. When I run this code, it returned 15. But now I have that 10 plus 5 inside a function, it returned nothing. So why is that? The reason for that is because when you have a set of code, a block of code within a function, it does not going to get printed out, or it does not get used until you call in that function. So I have to go add dash numbers, which is the function that we created here, in order for that to call in. So now if I run this part now, this code now, it should return 15. There you go, as expected. So when you create a function, in other words, a block of code, you can just use that unless you actually call in that function. So you need to call in that add numbers function we created up here. In most situations, we don't just create a function with static hard-coded block of code. In this case, that's what I did. This is a hard-coded static numbers, right? So you don't ever change this. Every single time you call in add numbers, it's just going to keep printing 15. For example, if I could add numbers a couple of times, if I clear the screen and if I run this, it's going to repeat 15, 15, 15, 15 because I'm recalling or calling in this block of code. In this case, it's just 10 plus 5, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and it print 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So in other words, this is what we call a static function. It's basically have a static code that keep getting repeated. Now, what if I want a dynamic one? So in most situations, like I said, we don't use these type of static hard-coded block of code. Instead, we use what we call a dynamic, or one that can do passing of parameters. Passing parameters allow us to interact with the code within a function, and that allow us to create more customized output out of this function. So let's create a dynamic or a function that can take parameters. So let's start with function again. And again, this is going to be a simple function, but let me show you how to properly write a function using this option. So I just basically call within this integrated environment, calling this function, and we have a function name we can put. So I'm going to call this let's put add values. And so just to make this function different from this function, instead of add numbers, I'm doing add values. And in order to pass in parameters, you start with param and then open bracket and close brackets, because this is where all your parameters going to go in. So this is what you typically use. That's why in this integrated environment, when you try to enter a create a function, and if you go with this first option, it automatically add that param part, right part, this part. Even though when you're first starting out, you can create a simple function where there are no parameters and with a static block of code. So in order for you to create a function that actually take in parameters, you need to have this param within that function code. And in here, we can give parameters. So let's say I want a parameter of integer. I'm just casting it to an integer, and I'm going to give a parameter number 1, and I'm going to get another parameter, another integer, and I want to have number 2. I'm very creative with my names, right? So you can have anything you like. You can have creative names and stuff like that. And this is basically a block of code now that has 2 numbers in it. Sorry, 2 parameters in it. Now I need to do something with these parameters. So it can take the parameters, but what it's going to do is basically nothing with those parameters. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to press enter after the parameter, this part, and I'm going to say I want to add them just like before. I'm going to add number 1 to number 2, because by doing this, what we are doing is taking these 2 numbers and adding them together. So now if I call this function in, so add values, because that's my function name right here, what will you expect to happen? Well, you're probably going to expect to, what you're going to expect to happen is that to ask this function for these 2 numbers, right? So let's see what happened. So if I run this block of code, this part, nothing. it just basically returns 0. So why didn't it ask for these two numbers? The reason for that is when you write a function like this in Windows PowerShell 7, it automatically set these two variables into 0. So right now, the variable num1 and variable num2 are set to 0 automatically by the Windows PowerShell 7. Because we didn't specify what these two are supposed to be, it basically adds 0 to 0 and returns 0. So again, I'm going to show you again. If I run this part of the code, this block, it's going to return the value of 0. So how can I pass variable values to here? If you just want to hard code this in the code of your PowerShell script, you can simply pass it by, for example, putting 10 space 5. That will give the variable 1 10 and variable 2 5. Unlike in other programming and scripting languages, in PowerShell you don't need to put a comma, you don't put a comma, you don't put brackets or anything like that. If you have two variables, you simply put a space. The space basically says the first value goes into the first variable, the second value goes into the second variable. So that's something to keep in mind. Now if I clear the screen, now if I run this block of code, it should return 15 because number 1 is variable 1 is associated with 10, the variable 2, which is number 2, is num2 is associated with 5, and then we are telling them to add here and it returns 15. So keep that in mind. If you do not give variable values, the Windows PowerShell will automatically set your variable to 0 and it will return 0 as a result. So you need to specify your values. Next thing you may be asking is, can I pass these values explicitly? In other words, this is right now implicit. So because 10 is here and the 5 is here, 10 automatically gets in here and the 5 gets in here, right? That's called implicit. But what if I want to do explicit? You can do that by calling in the function, which is add values, and then we're gonna go dash and gonna go num. We have num1, I mean. So for num1, number 1, I can say 10 and space, again a dash, like a like a line, which is on your keyboard right next to your plus equal key, and then you go num2 and then you put 5. So this is what we call explicitly defining variable. So if I run this block of code right now, it should return 15 still because number 1 is 10 and number 2 is 5. You can switch them around and you can put anything you like. For example, you don't need to put 5, you can put 20 for example, and it will still return the addition because we have the addition right here. In this case, in this situation, it should return 30 because reason for that is number 1 is now set to 10, num2 is set to 20. So this is called explicit passing of values. You can also just set the only one value. So let's say we want to put number 2 to just 5, but not define your number 1. If I run this piece of code, what it will return is just 5 because number 1, remember, will be automatically set to 0, equal to 0 by Windows PowerShell because it was not defined in here. So because this is defined as number 2 is defined as 5, we can simply print that out as 5. So in other words, you can pass values into your function either explicitly by using this dash and defining explicitly what variable that you want to pass and what value, or you can do it implicitly by doing just 10 and 5. For example, if I just put 10 here without any explicit definition, what that's going to do is just going to pass that 10 to the first variable. So that's what that is going to do in here. It's just going to pass that value just into the first variable. But if you want to pass it just into a second variable, you can do that. Like I said, put a dash in there and put the variable name, which is $sign. Sorry, not a variable name. Just don't put a $sign. Just put num, N-U-M, because the dash knows it is the variable. And then you can put 10 in here, and that will pass that 10 into the variable in the second place right here, num2. So again, it's very simple to pass variables. You can do it either implicit or explicit. If you do implicit, it's going to be in the order in which the variable appear here. If it is explicit, it will be the explicitly what you are defining will be cast into or pass that value into that variable. You can also take this output from this function, in other words, a result from this function, and save it into a variable. For example, if I go and create a variable called my results here, result equal. So remember, in Windows PowerShell, the $sign would create variables. Just like variables in the function up here, you can, I'm going to move this a little bit higher up. So just like where the variables inside the function here, I just create a variable outside the function, but I'm going to equate that to whatever the values getting out of this. So let's go back to our implicit, and I will just put 10 space 5. So num1 is 10, num2 is 5. And if I run this block of code, it will return nothing. Because reason for that is I haven't called in the variable that I have created here, even though I did call in the function, because function's output is now saved in this variable. So if I want to get the output of this, what I need to do is to simply call in this variable. So you can store the results of this function into a variable and then call in that variable later in your script. So this is a handy little thing that I use sometimes when I write PowerShells. I don't always call in the function and use it right away. I store it into a variable and then use it elsewhere. In fact, you can then take this variable and then can do other things with it. For example, I have 15 here, right? What if I want to divide this by something? So I can do that. Like I can, instead of recalling in a result just 15, I can take my result and I can do more things with it. Like I can do more math with it. For example, if I take the results, no, I just take the results and then let's say multiply by 5, for example. So if I clear this, let's do multiply by 2. It's easy. So let's just to be different, because it's 10 to 5, that's going to be confusing. So if I run this now, this block of code, oops, clear. If I run twice, I'll run one time. So if I run that block of code, so it gives me the result 10 plus 5 is 15, and if you multiply 15 by 2, 30. So by storing your result, your output of a function into a variable, you can then take that information and do more things with it, such as mathematical calculations. In this case, the result of this function is 15, but then I store it in my result variable and then multiply by that 15 by 2 as a output of that is 30, and that's what we get printed up down here. So that's an advantage of storing something in the output of a function into a variable. We can also use the result and do other things with it using the same variables contained within this function. For example, if I have my result and if I go plus equal and call in the function again, and this time I'm going to do 10, no, let's do 1 and 2. And now I print my result. If I run this part of the code, what it's going to result in the value of 18. The reason for that is it took the function, gave these two variables 10 and 5. They add together in here, and it resulted in 15, and then again ran the same function, calling this function, and gave these two variables 1 and 2, which is then added on top of whatever the results that ran in the line 10. So to 10 and 5, we see is what, 15, and then took the 15 and then again add 1 and 2 to this, to assign 1 and 2 to these two variables, and it is addition here, and is resulting 18 for 15, 16, 17, 18. So 15 is the output here, and the output here is 3. 15 plus 3 is 18. There you go. It's simple math, so it should be easy for you to understand. So I'm not going to go over anymore, but I just want to show you that you can take the same block of code and keep repeating that block of code and keep changing these these variables so that you can reuse this block of code for other things. So now I'm going to clear the screen. Next thing I'm going to talk to you about is how we can improve this block of code within this function. In other programming languages and scripting languages such as Java, we have this key term called return. In Windows PowerShell, return is still a keyword, even though it is not necessarily for you to use it. For example, in here, it clearly returned the addition of these two values even without the return keyword. But as a good practice, because in other programming languages you use that return keyword and it is still a valid keyword in Windows PowerShell 7 and previous versions, I recommend you that you use the return keyword in your functions. So only thing you need to do here is, for this calculation, I'm going to enter return. And as you can see, it turns into this same color as param because it is a valid keyword. It didn't change this function. It didn't change what this function is doing. So if I delete this part because I don't need that, and if I just simply adding value 10 and 5, and it's exactly doing that. It's returned 15 because I add value 10 and 5 to the these two variables, and I store it in my results variable, and I print it, and it's printed 15. So this return keyword didn't do anything to basically improve your function's functionality, but rather it make it easier for you to build that muscle memory, because this is a key term that is used in other programming languages and scripting environments. So I recommend that you use that key term in here as well. Now, what if I want to print these two numbers instead of actually printing the value? Can you do that? Yeah, you can. So instead of return, you can also do write-output. What that will do, it will not return 15. Instead, it will return 10 plus 5. So if I run this part of the code, it will simply return 10 plus 5. So what write output did, it just basically take whatever in here, put it into these variables and print it as exactly what you see right here. It just took the 10, put it into num1, it took the 5, put it into num2, and just printed 10 plus 5. It didn't do the calculation. So in functions like this, you can do a lot of things like this. Like for example, I can, print it that, and also I can return it. Again, you don't need the return keyword key term here. It'll still do the same calculation, but I'm just doing it to just show you. If I run this part of the code now, it'll not only give you 10 plus 5, how it arrived at 15, but it also give you the 15 because I'm asking the return right here. So I'm just giving you a few more things that you can do with a function like this. Again, I recommend that you use this key term, the return key term, whenever you are writing a function, because it will improve your muscle memory for not only the Windows PowerShell, but also when you are using other scripting and programming languages. Again, if you want to write these values out onto the terminal or to your code, again, you can do write output, and then put these two values, these two variables, and it'll simply print. Like I said, it'll simply print the variable values stored in this two in there, right? So write output will do that. So it needs to come actually at the before the return. So keep that in mind. So those are few options that you have available in in functions. There are a lot more you can do with functions, but I'm just giving you some key points in this lecture. And that's everything for today. I just want to keep this thing short and simple as possible for those who are new to Windows PowerShell 7. Please make sure to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. Until your next PowerShell lesson, thank you so much and have a nice day.